amongst us. One who's joining us via Zoom, Chenetu, and comrade, the leadership, Umulawuti, to take us through some of the writings and the books that they've published. But that, before we get there, we can't continue without acknowledging the historical day which we are gathered today, which is the June 16 of 1976. I think it is very much important that we honor the resilient and the undying spirit of the comrades, the young people who stood and faced face-to-face head-on the racist apartheid government, and also in it trying to push in African state in South Africa. So I think it is important that we honor that in the spirit of young people. I don't know, Amakabane seemed distracted, especially there at the back. There was a song I once heard in some of the gatherings I've went to. I think comrade voice, the comrades coming from the Revolutionary Library might assist with this song. Comrade Lunga. I'm not a great singer, but just to get a makaban together, yeah. Lumkosa lo gum Africa lom Zulu lo gum Africa lom Tswana lo gum Africa lom Zulu lo gum Africa lom Venda lo gum Africa lom Ndebele gum Africa sonke singama Africa sonke singama Africa lomxhosa lo gum Africa lomzulu lo gum Africa lomndebele gum Africa lomvenda lo gum Africa sonke singama Africa sonke singama Africa lomlungu lo uyasithakatha bathakatha isizwe semnyama lamabhulu ayasithakatha athakatha isizwe semnyama lamabhulu ayasithakatha athakatha isizwe semnyama lomxhosa lo gum Africa lomzulu lo gum Africa lomsuthu lo gum Africa lomndebele gum Africa sonke singama Africa sonke singama Africa Mahla wethu one plate one settler high moral high discipline. Comrades, thank you for that. I think it is very much important when we honor such undying spirits of people like Stephen Bantu Biko, T.H. Machinini, and other young people whom I have not mentioned. And also, comrades, I think it is important that Some people might not understand when we talk about an undying spirit, especially in the African context, because we believe that people who are amongst us might leave us in the physical flesh and be buried, but their spirit remains amongst us. And how do we see this? We see this when their ideas live on. I'm sure comrades Zama won't argue with me when I mention this, that the struggle of Rhodes Must Fall is of the spirit of the generation of 1976. The decolonial project, the spirit of Fees Must Fall. When young Black students felt out of place in these institutions such as UCT, WITS, VETS, Rhodes, Stellenbosch, when they felt like they don't belong, the only thing that made sense is the ideas of people like Steve Biko and the ideas of people like Walter Rodney, which bring us to this book launch we have today. So joining us via Zoom, Chinedu is going to be taking us through the book, A Rebel's Guide to Walter Rodney. I think it is important that we also note that today, as Tshisimani, we are closing the series which began on Monday, where we first viewed the context where Walter Rodney was living, and also yesterday where we went through some of his ideas, especially explicit in the book called How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. So we appreciate comrades that continued to be here even today to witness the final day where we close the series. So without further ado, comrade Mulawoti is going to be engaging the comrade via on the Zoom, just to take us through the book, or the Rebel's Guide to Walter. So before Mulawoti comes through, I would like, I know there's this culture whereby we go through the biography of the writers. I think it is important, especially when we have young Black people who have done tremendous work. But now technology sabotaged me, Simone. My phone has died. I did advise that this biography be written on paper. My phone has died. Simone. No, it's fine. It's fine. Young people will do it afterwards. It's fine. Yeah, because my problem with this comrade Mulawut is that when we do these biographies, they bring up high expectations. So I think it's fine that we interact with the person, then we hear what you've done afterwards. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Shall we via Zoom, just to give us a brief on the work that he has done, compiling this book. Then comrade Mulawuti is going to continue with this session. So, Mantla, Janet, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Yeah.
Yeah, you can carry on, comrade.
Thank you, and that was such a moving and emotional honor, to Youth Day. Amazing, and comrade, you say you can't sing, but honestly, you have a voice. You can sing better than most people I know. Trust me. Anyways, let's get back to business. Listen, I wrote my book, comrade, because I think the Afro-Guyanese historian, Walter Rodney, is one of the most brilliant revolutionaries of the last century, but he's also one of the most understudied, especially if you compare him to the likes of Malcolm X, Angela Davis, or even Frantz Fanon. And in terms of Rodney's political identity, I mean, Rodney has been defined as many things, you see. Some people call him a Pan-Africanist. Some people call him a guerrilla intellectual. Some of Rodney's closest friends and supporters call themselves Rodneyites. And I think all these definitions are true and marvelous in some way. But in my book, you see, I wanted to put forward that Walter Rodney was above all else a Marxist, somebody who fought for the self-emancipation of ordinary working people, and somebody who fought for the liberation of the oppressed. Somebody who saw Marxism not just as a tool of thought, but as a revolutionary theory and a guide to action. So my book, in many crucial respects, is about how Rodney engaged with Marxism through his incredible life story in Africa, Europe, and the Americas. And I think in recent years, there's been a renewed interest for Rodney's radical ideas, because what have we seen in the world? We've seen the Black Lives Matter movement. We've seen Rose Must Fall. We've seen countless movements to decolonize education. And what you have in these movements is young people who are challenging state racism, challenging police brutality. And when they're doing so, they're also questioning history. In Bristol, in the UK, they were pulling down the statues of racist slave owners. And I think in that process, there's a real desire to uncover the voices of marginalized people who spoke out against imperialism, who spoke out against the legacies of empire. And Rodney increasingly is becoming more and more this go-to person, especially his magnificent work, High Europe, Underdeveloped Africa, which I'll say a word a bit later. So obviously, the other aim of my book here was to get young, especially Black people, acquainted with Rodney's life and work, and to put Rodney's life and work in context, because it might seem quite distant from 2022. And I think that the first thing to really remember about Rodney's early years is that there was a real actuality of anti-colonial struggle and march towards independence across the globe. Because Rodney was born in 1942 in British Guyana, where he grew up there in the 1950s. And British Guyana, of course, was a British colony in Latin America, but culturally, it's part of the Caribbean. And Rodney's parents were, if you want, supporters of the independence movement in Guyana, which was a movement that called itself like a Marxist to some degree, but it was the only game in town. And it was the movement that was fighting the British. And this was a really rare moment in Guyanese history, because you have the two major groups in Guyana. So the Africans who come from slavery, and the Indo-Guyanese who are actually united together against the British. And this is really rare, because usually the colonial authorities in Guyana were very good at keeping the two groups apart by playing divide and rule between the two groups. And that will have a positive influence in Rodney's political development. But anyways, Rodney is brilliant. So at 18, he earns a scholarship to go to Jamaica when Jamaica is about to become independent. And there he learns about African history, that identity that has been wiped out through slavery and colonialism in Black people. He goes to Cuba and becomes a fan of the Cuban Revolution. And eventually Rodney goes to London, where he gets a PhD in African history at the age of 24, which is incredible. But while he's in London, you see, he joins an informal Marxist study group that is taught by the author of Black Jacobins, C.L.R. James, fantastic account on the Haitian Revolution. And C.L.R. James makes Rodney read the classics in Marxist literature. Like, they read passages of Capital, they read the 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon Bonaparte. But they also discuss, the liberation struggle that's going on in Africa, especially in the Portuguese colonies. So you have Rodney reading people like Amilcar Cabral, Fanon, and of course, Che Guevara, who he's a fan of. And so you have here, in a nutshell, the formation of an African historian who's very interested in Marxism. But it's really from the year 1968 to 1980 where Rodney's life becomes really interesting, where he emerges as this radical theoretician and this activist who engages more and more with Marxism. And so I want to talk you through like some of the major themes in Rodney's life, because I think the first thing that jumps to mind was Rodney's life and activism says a lot about the role of radical intellectuals, especially radical intellectuals operating in the global South. And it really raises the question, what does it really mean to be a radical intellectual? Is it simply to write your spicy article against capitalism in a language that nobody understands and then to go home and forget about the class struggle? Or is there more to it than that? And in Rodney's life example, there is more to it than that, you know. In Rodney's life, there's always this real attempt to link his radical ideas against imperialism to the practical activities of the masses, to the practical activities of the ordinary men and women in the global South who are making history, who are changing history. And one powerful example of that is when Rodney is an activist in Jamaica during the year 1968, which is, of course, the year of Black Power and the year of global revolts. Rodney at the time is 26 only, and he's teaching at the University of the West Indies in Kingston, Jamaica. And he shows there that he's very different from most academics in the sense that he does not sit in his ivory tower. He's somebody who lives off campus, who goes and tries to relate to the masses. So one day you can find Rodney in the ghettos of Kingston, you know, giving a speech on African history or on Jamaican politics to Rastafarians and unemployed youths. You can see him visiting, talking to different people, listening to people. And it's through Rodney's speeches on Jamaican politics and African history and his overall interactions with the masses that Rodney develops a version of Black Power that is adapted for the Jamaican context and the wider Caribbean. Now remember, Black Power in 1968 is the slogan that comes from the United States at first. And it's the slogan of a Black minority that faces job and housing discrimination and police brutality at the hands of white officers and white police agents. You know, Stokely Carmichael at the time, who's the architect of Black Power in America, is calling for Blacks to control the politics and the economics of their community. In the Caribbean, it's a whole different ballgame because Black people in many instances are in the majority. You know, the president is Black or at least non-white. And the problem here is that the local elite colludes with the Western foreign companies, with the Western imperialism. You know, the mines in Jamaica are owned by the Americans and the Canadians. And these masses, this elite is also keeping the masses oppressed and poor, as it were, under colonialism. So in Rodney's formulation of Black Power, there's a very ambitious and class struggle tone to it, where he's calling on the Black oppressed masses to take over the control of the economics and the politics, not of the community, but of the whole nations in the Caribbean, where he's calling for, you know, a revolutionary struggle against imperialism and against the local allies of imperialism. And for Rodney, you know, out of his writings on Black Power, which are in a pamphlet called Grabbing with My Brothers, you find a very political definition of Blackness. You're not Black simply because, you know, simply because of some like mystical union that you might have to Africa. You're Black very concretely because you're a victim of racism and imperialism. And in fact, you're Black not just because you're African. When Rodney is talking about Black, he's also talking about the Indian community. You know, the Indians are like the majority in places like Trinidad and Tobago and in his whole time Guyana. So what Rodney is really trying to do with this definition of political Blackness, you know, is tie the destinies of the Jamaican masses to the other people in the third world who are fighting against imperialism. And eventually, you know, his activism in Jamaica, his links with the masses managed to frustrate the government. And the government bans him from Jamaica when he's coming back from a conference. And when news spread that Rodney is banned from Jamaica, there's the students who protest, and they're joined by Rastafarians and unemployed youths and it becomes a rebellion. For over 2 days, they burn buses, they fight to get him back. And it's an extraordinary event, which really testifies to like the influence that he had on the island, how he could articulate the grievances of the Black masses who were marginalized and who had this rising Black consciousness on the island. Eventually, the riots fell and they failed to bring back Rodney in Jamaica. But let me move on to another important lesson on Rodney's life, because I think Rodney's life is also one where he comes to realize the difference between socialism from above and socialism from below. And this transformation, if you like, becomes evident when Rodney is a history professor in Tanzania from 1969 to 1974. And Tanzania at the time, you should remember, was the absolute mecca of African liberation. Tanzanian first president Nyerere, was quite a progressive African president, where he hosted loads of African liberation movements in Southern Africa. So it's the kind of place where you could wine and dine with freedom fighters from Mozambique, but also go to a conference by CLR James in the same evening. But you see, the problem with Tanzanian socialism is that it was really the socialism of the petty bourgeoisie, this small minority that was educated under colonialism and that gained state power from the colonial masses. But instead of sharing power with the massive, this small minority, which was Nyerere and the bureaucrats around him, didn't share power with the workers and peasants. But what they did is that they put the workers and peasants to work even harder. And how could you see this in Tanzania? Well, it was a very state-driven process, where what the Tanzanian state did is that it nationalized the banks, it nationalized the main factories, but it also forced the peasants into collective farms. That's what Ujamaa was about. It forced the peasants into collective farms, and in doing so, it thought that it could increase production so that Tanzania could withstand the pressures from the international market and the international economy. At first, Rodney comes out in support of this because he thinks it's a radical way to eradicate poverty. But the problem is that as time goes on, he realizes that honestly, this policy of collectivization in the countryside has terrible effects, where the peasants are often forced against their will into these villages, where the peasants have no control whatsoever in terms of what to produce, when to produce, how to produce. Their life is in the control of these elitist bureaucrats. And so Rodney does document the resistance of peasants, but more importantly, he also pays attention to the resistance of workers in the nationalized factories in Tanzania. And he sees that these workers too are unsatisfied with their conditions, where these workers are leading wildcat strikes and occupations against the bureaucracy. And he says that these workers are leading a struggle that goes beyond simple bread and butter issues. They're really posing the question of who controls production in a so-called socialist society. Who is the boss in a socialist society? Is it the small bureaucracy, the elitist bureaucracy, or is it the workers? And obviously, Rodney's answer is that it's the workers. And so you see him coming back to the core of Marxism, that the self-emancipation of the working class must be the act of the workers themselves. Nobody can liberate the workers but themselves. And that he sees that the workers, through their struggles in Tanzania, hold the keys to building a new democratic society from below. Now, Tanzania is also the place where Rodney writes his most famous book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. And it's the 50 years of that book now. And Rodney in his book is asking a key question, why is it that 10 years after independence, most African nations haven't broken ties with the former colonial powers while they're still poor and underdeveloped? Why are all these racist Western thinkers saying that African underdevelopment is the fault of Africans themselves without looking at the larger forces that are at play? And How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, sets the record straight. It tells the story of how the European bourgeoisie, through the slave trade and colonialism, robbed Africa of its natural resources and labor. And while this robbery impoverished Africa, it also contributed to the further development of capitalism in Europe, of the industrial relationship. So if you want African underdevelopment and Europe's development are two sides of the same coin. Now, I have an anecdote on the significance of Rodney's book, because when I was 19, 20, I went to a Pan-African study group. And the people who were teaching that Pan-African study group were absolutely haunted by the sentence of the French president, Nicolas Sarkozy. In 2007, the French president said that the problem with Africa and why Africa is poor is because the African man hasn't entered history. He was basically saying that Africa has no history, some racist shit. You know, the opening chapters of Rodney's book were a real antidote to that statement, because Rodney in his book uses historical materialism to reconstruct African pre-colonial society in all its dynamism and all its complexity, showing that Africa in the 16th century before Europe had mostly communal societies where people had more or less equal access to land, and wealth was distributed more or less equally, but also more like, you know, class-ridden formations that resembled the feudal empires in Europe, like in Ethiopia and the Congo. I mean, Natasha Shivji gave up a great talk about that a few days ago. But also, let me move on here to say that what I like about Rodney is that in the final chapter of his book, he spends a lot of time destroying the racist assumption that colonialism did some good for Africans. So, you know, when I was growing up in Europe, this is what my teachers used to tell me. They used to be like, you know, colonialism was bad, but, you know, it had some good things for Africa, because the colonizers built railways, because the colonizers bought healthcare. Now, Rodney's book gave me counter arguments to every single one of those points. You know, in how Europe underdeveloped Africa, he says, listen, guys, the railways weren't built so that Africans could visit their friends. You know, all the train lines, they went from the interior to the country to the port so that raw materials could be shipped for the benefit of Europe's ruling class. On the question of healthcare, Rodney gives the example of the Portuguese Empire. You know, the Portuguese were in Africa for over 500 years. And in 500 years, they weren't able to train one single doctor in Mozambique. And that was the brutal reality of colonialism that Rodney talked about. And what Rodney is trying to tell Africans on the eve, 10 years after independence, is that, you know, if you want real development, a society with no poverty, where everybody is free to make their own choices, to develop their skills, to make use of their ability and live their best life, well, you need to break with the capitalist system, with the imperialist system, because it's the capitalist system which has been the principal agent for African underdevelopment for centuries. And this is a powerful message at the heart of his book. Now, let me say something about Rodney's final years, because I think there's important lessons here on understanding racism and how to fight it. Because you see, in 1974, Rodney returns to Guyana to fight against a dictatorship which called itself socialist, but that was state capitalist in ways that was even more vicious than in Tanzania. And this dictatorship was ran by an Afro-Guyanese dictator, and if you like, the Afro-Guyanese bureaucracy. And this bureaucracy was very good at playing divide and rule between the African and the Indian working class in Guyana, where it would send African scabs, for instance, to break up the strike of Indian workers, where it would recruit Africans to the police force. You know, all these kinds of like mechanisms that kept the working class divided. And when Rodney returns to Guyana, naturally he finds a Guyana that's divided, that's very different from the one of his childhood. And his writings and his speeches at the time try to understand the history of that racial divide within the working class, and to see how these racial divisions can be overcome. And what Rodney develops really is a materialist explanation for the existence of racism under capitalism, where he says that, you know, the racism that you see in Guyana in the 1970s is not just a matter of like prejudice or of inherent cultural difference. You know, it's the product of a system. It's the product of a system that we call capitalism. Because remember, racism is the ideology of the European bourgeoisie. And in Guyana, in the plantation system, it becomes the ideology, obviously, of the planter class, used first to justify the enslavement of Blacks. And Rodney tells the story in his famous book, A History of the Guyanese Working People, that when the African slaves win their freedom on the plantation, they become wage laborers on the plantation. And as wage laborers, you know, the ex-slaves, they fight for like higher wages on the plantations, and they win. But the planter class and the colonial authorities who get scared of that, they realize pretty early on that they can use a cheaper source of labor from India in order to undercut the wages of the Black workers, in order to break the back of this growing Black militancy. And by doing so, the racism in Guyana was used, if you like, to intensify this competition over jobs between the former African slave and the Indian indentured laborers. And the reason for this divide of rule was obviously to keep the wages as low as possible. And so the two groups begin to like hate each other and relate to each other via the stereotypes that were invented by the white planters. So the African sees the Indian as a slave of the master who was just a yes man who would work for, who would be exploited at any rate, while the Indian worker sees the African as lazy, somebody who would have starved without indentureship. You see, this is why racism ideology appealed to the working class in Guyana, because it offered them a false sense of comfort in the face of the brutal exploitation and misery that they were suffering in the island. And this racist manipulation that comes from the ruling classes in Guyana, continues throughout Guyanese history, even after independence in many ways, when the ruling class is non-white, because for the ruling class to maintain itself in power, it has an advantage in dividing the two groups and getting the two groups to hate each other so they don't realize their common interests. But as I end here, Rodney says that, there's moments in Guyanese history where the racial divisions have been broken down, where the two groups of African and Indo-Guyanese workers have been able to unite. And what Rodney underlines here is the centrality of the class struggle for fighting racism, because he shows us that when the Afro-Guyanese workers have been fighting in the streets, in the workplace, alongside the Indo-Guyanese workers, well, they've realized their common interest against exploitation, against capital, and naturally they've managed to overcome their racial prejudices to unite, if you want, against their bosses. And Rodney says, those examples in Guyanese history, there are many of them. There's one in 1905, there's one during the anti-colonial struggle, and those spontaneous moments of unity are actually great. The problem is that they break down way too easily when the repression sets in. And so Rodney's lesson here that he draws is that you need an organization that can help transform that sporadic unity among the working classes into a permanent, undoable link. And how that translates into Rodney's practical activity is that he goes into the 1970s in Guyana into building like a mass revolutionary party called the Working People's Alliance. And it's a revolutionary party that starts out as a pressure group, but becomes a revolutionary party as it grows. And its function is really to conduct a political education among the working class, to carry out that anti-racist argument among the working class, and at the same time to put forward a case against the brutal dictatorship in Guyana, which is exploiting the people, which calls itself socialist but isn't, and to put forward, and Rodney wants to put forward a genuine case for socialism from below. And this is quite successful for Rodney in the final years of his life, because in 1979 in Guyana, you have a wave of mass protests and strikes. And Rodney's political party really manages to strive in that environment. They become the organization that people look to for collective action, the people that they listen to, and they manage to do incredible things. They managed to get Indian workers to donate to support African workers on strike. The public meetings that they organized in the countryside turned into like spontaneous marches. And Rodney in his speeches at the time is really becoming an amazing leader, where he's saying that, what we need is a general strike, a multiracial general strike, because it's you, the working people in Guyana, who are the source of power of the dictatorship. It's because you work that the dictatorship can sustain itself. So if you withdraw your ability to labor, well, you can bring down the dictatorship to its knees, because you are the source of power that comes from it. And what he's doing is that he's really breaking the wall of fear among the dictatorship, because the dictatorship owned like 80% of the economy. So if you spoke out against it, you could be fired or lose your job. And here you have Rodney speaking with his party, calling the dictator King Kong, calling the dictator a loser, which is absolutely fascinating. And, read about this struggle because it's very much unknown. Unfortunately, like most revolutionary struggles, the one in Guyana didn't succeed. And by September 1979, there was less protests and less strikes. The masses' civil rebellion was beaten back by the government. And this was a problem for Rodney and his comrades because they were left isolated. You know, they could no longer be protected by the masses. And of course, they knew that the government was out to kill them. Members of his party had been killed. And so they were taking enormous risk, if you want, to prepare for the next uprising by improving the communication within the party. And so we come to Rodney's death, for instance, on the 13th of June, 1980. You see, on that day, Rodney and his brother, they went to buy a walkie-talkie from an ex-soldier who was actually working as an informant for the dictatorship. So they set him up and he bought the walkie-talkie. And when he activated the walkie-talkie, unfortunately, it blew up in his face and it killed him. Luckily enough, his brother survived to tell the tale, but even years after, the dictatorship tried to frame him with the crime, and he's only been absolved of it, like just recently. And that is the sad end to Rodney's life. But if you look at the last pages of my book, and I know that you've printed out copies there, you will see images of Rodney's funeral, which was the biggest funeral in Guyana. You know, you had about 35 to 50,000 people at the funeral. And you had Guyanese that were African and Indian, from all races, from all genders, all walks of life, who had come to celebrate this incredible hero, this fascinating hero, somebody who fought for their self-emancipation, you know, somebody who encouraged them to struggle even if the odds were against them. And the Guyanese working people there really realized that they had lost one of their brightest and most brilliant leaders. And I think if we're serious about being revolutionary today, I think it's our duty as revolutionaries to make sure that Rodney's legacy lives on and that we take on our own capitalist class, no matter where we be. That's all I have to say. Thank you, comrades.
Thank you, Chinedu. Let's give him a round of applause again. Thank you for the wonderful presentation, taking us through your work to properly understanding this work. I think the presentation taken into context and also partnered with the presentation by Natasha are actually saying to us, Walter Rodney gave us a very sharp analytical framework to understand our realities so that we build movements, so that we build a particular consciousness that is going to be able to overcome the logics of oppression, especially when it comes to capitalist imperialism and as well as when it comes to patriarchy and settler colonialism. I am sure the audience will, of course, have questions that it will pose to you. I have gone through the guide. It is actually reader friendly and it makes things easier specifically for activists on the ground. It does not have a sophisticated jargon. It's very simple, it's reader friendly, and I am sure movement and people can relate with it. So I just want to applaud you for what you have done in giving us a very proper and practical guide to Ronnie's work. I just want to check with you, perhaps we can start with 2 questions. Yes, I just want to check with you, Chinedu, how far do you think, having offered us Rodney's analysis and his understanding of the world, and how the so-called global South have to conduct its politics when it comes to capitalist imperialism in pursuit of proper national independence. How far do you think the people and movements of the global South have come in understanding Rodney and in undermining the logic of settler colonialism when it comes to our case, but generally in undermining the logic of capitalist imperialism? And that is the first question. According to your understanding or your analysis,
in relation to how you understand Rodney, how far do we think we have come to actually building our societies around his ideas and also organizing movements for liberation around his ideas? First question. Second question is, you wrote an essay, I think, in the Journal of Political Economy in 2019. Why are you laughing? Yeah, you wrote an essay, developing some critique around Walter Rodney's argument that the African working class suffered or were exploited more than the European working class. I just want to check, are you still holding that particular view, or you have since changed? If you are still holding that particular view, are there any existing justifiable political grounds upon which you are basing your argument? Or if you have shifted, what has made you shift from the argument which is there in the archives, which you made in 2019? So those are the two questions that I will start with. And the latter question basically seeks to move us towards a moment of praxis, because in order for us to achieve freedom, we need to be authentic in our critique of the capitalist imperialist system, but also to develop an element of self-criticism as movements which are in pursuit of national independence, proper and freedom. So I'll just pose those two questions, and then we'll take it from there and deliberate more on what we have presented. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for that. So in terms of like African movements, how far they've come, when I look at the continent of Africa in recent years, I can't help but feel like a real sense of pride at the various movements that have emerged. And when I think about this, I think about I'm thinking about the Arab Spring in 2010, which was this powerful movement against dictatorship. I'm thinking also about the Algerian revolution, which got rid of Bouteflika, a very advanced process. I'm also thinking about Sudan, which was perhaps an even more advanced process than Algeria. I'm also thinking about like places like Burkina Faso, which had amazing movements that way, where you have the rise, of a new generation of young people. I feel that in many parts of the continent that it's not having it, that is not having it anymore. That faces like attacks by political dictators who are keen on like lowering their standard of living, keen on keeping them marginalized politically, economically, and spiritually as well. And I think by taking up arms and struggle, the African youth in so many different places have done already a tremendous amount of work, I think, to honor Rodney's legacy in that sense. But then, we have questions to ask of these movements because these movements haven't succeeded. Time and time again, I think they seem to fail. And so the question becomes, what can we draw from Rodney's experience, for when the next time these movements occur, they would need to be informed by in many ways. And I think one very important thing in Rodney's experience is when he comes to understand the strategic role that the working class plays within the capitalist system. Even though the working class isn't a majority in all African societies, in Algeria, for instance, it was a minority. However, it is a very powerful group, you know, that is located in strategic places in the economy, strategic sectors. And by using that working class ability, you know, to disrupt production, can intensify and deepen that revolutionary process in terms of like it can, you know, stop the dictatorship from producing, from running the economy, and stuff like that. I mean, like, I remember like a comrade from Egypt was telling me I think 2012 or 2013, there was one of these mass general strikes in Egypt where all the train operators, you know, went on strike, and they were only running one train, which was to one part of the city, to like Tahrir Square. And you could see really the power of the working class in that process. And I think that we need to come to an understanding that you know, working class activity, you know, its involvement is like fundamental in terms of like, you know, deepening that revolutionary process. The other thing also, I think there's loads of like subjective factors, is also understanding like that we need an organization that can deepen the revolutionary process. Because, you know, Rodney's life is one way he reflects on the question of spontaneity. And in a lot of like these revolutionary process, well, yeah, you do have a spontaneous like boil of anger against dictatorship and stuff like that. But the problem is that, you know, spontaneity can die down quite easily. You know, it sets up like a few leaders who become like, I don't know, a group like the SPA, which are really in Sudan, which are like a petit bourgeois formation. And what happens with these people is that, you know, they enter into negotiations with the military dictatorship and end up compromising the struggle that was already at an advanced stage. So I think Rodney's lesson, especially through the formation of the Working People Alliance, is that you need this organization that is rooted among the working classes, that does this like work, you know, this political education among the working classes, but also that strengthens itself by recruiting the best activists around them, those who can like, you know, develop intellectually the party, understand the situation, but also relate that back to the masses, so that the next time the struggle occurs, you know, the energy of the masses can't just be channeled into like compromission, but it's channeled into a definitive revolutionary struggle against the ruling classes in those countries. And that's I think a fundamental legacy, because Rodney's life really is in many ways one way he thinks about the question of organization. You know, what kind of organization do we need to go against the states, to go against the capitalist and imperialist states which are trying to oppress us in many ways, if that answers the question. Also, I think there's I'll talk about it later when there's some questions, but I want to move on to the thing on dependency theory, because I'm laughing that you brought it up, because I wrote the blog post like 3 years ago, and I think if I wrote it now, I would change some things in the way in which I carry the argument and give it a lot more thought, and also you know, base my arguments much stronger in current actual Marxist work that has been done. But to give you a short question of the answer, I do agree with the general thrust of my argument and my general left critique of how Europe underdeveloped Africa. But none of this is in my Rebels Guide, comrade, because I didn't want to put it in my Rebels Guide, because I didn't want to steer away from the fact that, you know, how Europe underdeveloped Africa needs to be respected as a Marxist history, a Marxist work in African political economy in its own right, which is extremely radical and something that is a seminal work that anybody should read, you know, despite that it has flaws. You know, there's no such thing as a perfect Marxist. This is why Marxists like debate between each other, so we can improve our understanding of the world today. And I just want to say that Rodney's book in the chapter draws a lot on like dependency theory. Now, dependency theory was a radical body of work at the time. And we must understand that it was radical, especially when you look at, you know, the Western kind of like development theory that was said at the time, it was really prescriptive. It was simply about saying that, oh, you know, Africa needs to industrialize because it's like Europe in the 19th century, and basically it has to go through the same stages as European society. I mean, this really like prescriptive nonsense. What dependency theory does is that it says, well, no, what you have to do is look at Africa as integrated into a larger whole, as integrated into the international economy. And what happens when Africa is integrated into capitalism? Well, you get slavery, you get colonialism, all these things that set Africa back in many ways. Now, where I come to my criticism on Rodney is where he tries to understand, you know, the conditions of African labor under imperialism, you know, because if you come with the argument that the African working class was more exploited than the European working class, well, then you would have to draw the conclusion that there would be more foreign investment in Africa, that there would be a bigger desire to build like industries and factories in Africa. But the problem is that imperialism in the time after Rodney produces his book is less and less about Africa in the sense of exploitation of labor, of course. Imperialism like doesn't give two shits about the African continent, partly because like all the nations across the world become like almost like most of the grain at the time comes from like Australia and the US. You know, they become like self-sufficient in raw materials. All of the foreign investment in the 1970s and 1980s really goes to like the Western developed countries in Europe. And we have to remember what Marxist theory of labor value, you know, in that theory of labor value, what he's saying is that really what you have to pay attention to is the relationship between the wages of the worker and the amount of like surplus that they actually create for the capitalist in the process of production. And workers in the global north who work with like a higher technologies, higher productivity because they get more investments in it, well, are definitely like more exploited. What I will say is that workers in the global south are much more oppressed than workers in the global north. And oppression and exploitation are not the same thing. Oppression means that workers in the global south are absolutely treated like shit in their factories, where they work terrible long hours a day under terrible working conditions, terrible, not in some instances not allowed to have like unions or the kind of organization. And this poses different questions for the working class in Africa and in other parts of the global south, where the working class is more of a small minority, but one that still has like power, but one that also has to build like alliances with other classes, other oppressed classes in society, like, you know, the different like slum dwellers, one that has to build alliances with the peasants, all these people. These are questions that you don't have to ask yourself in the global north, where in every society, 80% of the population is like working class. So, you know, there's different problematics out here, and I'm still thinking through these questions, and I don't have a definitive answer. But what I will say, yeah, I do definitely still agree with the main thrust of that argument, and that we also have to bear in mind that it's a small portion of Rodney's book. You know, it's not the whole thing, but it's something that we need to continue like discussing.
Thanks, Chinedu. So I'm going to ask that let's ask the last question in the interest of time. And Chinedu, I'm going to time you so that the answer you give it in exactly 1 minute. Then we allow the rest of them. The landlord is keeping a stopwatch, so yeah, we're in trouble. So that is the crisis. So he's going to ask one last question. Then in 59 seconds, then you respond. then yeah, we get the rest of the room.
Thank you very much. Thank you for giving us the answer to the questions. But I think the latter question that was posed, we still have to discuss more. And I just want to say, you know, when you go to history books or social science books, or even economic books, you are told that post-Second World War, there were rising wages and, you know, conditions of life became better and all those things. But we are rarely told that it happened to some people, not to other people. You know, those were the realities of Western Europe and North America, not the realities of the global South, especially in the African societies. So I think we will have to, at some point, when we get time, discuss more the claim that you are making, which I think it's a bit problematic for me to fully agree with. But just one last question. You said something very important around Walter Rodney developing a historical materialistic critique of capitalist imperialism. What would you say to you know, movements and people, you know, there are national liberation movements which are now starting to lose power, who are conveniently using figures such as Walter Rodney, Angela Davis, Steve Biko, Fanon, you know, to legitimize their hold on power. What could you say to any movement that seeks to conveniently use or reconcile a historical materialistic critique of society with some liberal postulations which are in no way going to challenge or overcome the structural and the systemic realities that Africa faces? I think that is my last question to you. Now, how do we deal with the reconciliation where even supposedly movements that are claiming to hold or to possess a revolutionary outlook seek to reconcile a historical materialist take with some liberal postulations which are in no way going to undermine the structural and systemic logic of oppression that the countries and societies of the global South are still facing? Thank you very much.
So wait, I'm expected to answer this in like 1 minute.
Yeah.
You gotta be joking. Okay. Listen, comrade, I think you raised an important point, right? This is not a new point. Like Lenin, who's arguably one of the greatest revolutionaries, wrote about this in The State of Revolution. You know, what happens to like revolutionary thinkers once they die? You know, during their lifetime, they're hated by the system or ignored. And after they die, well, they become like harmless icons. You know, people who become canonized. And what he's saying is that he's also saying that, you know, the revolutionary edge of their theory becomes like blunted, cut off, where they become, just like a sanitized version. And I think we have to stop this from happening when it comes to like Walter Rodney. And I'll give you an example, because I'm not based in the global South. I'm based in the global North, in the UK, and how this is happening. My former university, SOAS, organized an event celebrating High Europe Underdeveloped Africa with the very people that Rodney would hate. A SOAS director who's from South Africa, who's known for crushing the student protest in South Africa, and who used the N-word at SOAS in front of like Black students. And if you don't know who I'm talking about, look it up. He's the one who hosted that event and who was allowed to host that event. The other person who was the discussant is the vice chancellor, so, a member of the elites of a ruling class in the Caribbean. You know, this is how Rodney is being sanitized nowadays. I think if we want to reclaim Rodney, the best way to do it is to engage in struggle against any kinds of oppression in society, and struggle against the the elite that rules us. And what I mean by that is that by engaging in struggle, well, you have the awakening of like mass consciousness. And through that mass consciousness, well, we can encourage people to go back to Rodney, to draw out the real revolutionary character of his thinking, but also like to criticize it, to engage with it creatively, to move it forward, because that's what's really important in our time today, to figure out how Rodney speaks to our time and how we can learn lessons in struggle through what he wrote. But this depends really on the movements that we build, that we go forward, and we encourage all of these movements to start by reading How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, see how that still applies or doesn't apply to the current context, see how we can develop it, pull forward, see that how Rodney's analysis experience in Guyana fighting dictatorship can relate to our current day practice, but without being clumsy in how we transpose that experience into our own, because we always need, a concrete study of the concrete conditions that we are involved in, and on the abstract, that's how I would answer that question, if that makes sense.
Thank you very much, Chinedu. We have actually kept the 1 minute above you on.
So I had more to say on it, but like I'll come back to it in the discussion.
And now definitely, you're going to come back. So now this is an opportunity to invite the rest of the house to the conversation that is being had here by the two speakers. So now this is a time for hands. We're going to take few hands because we are already out of time. There will be no second round comments. So speak now or forever hold your peace. I see the men's choir on the side. Okay.
Please don't hold your peace.
Leadership and the commander and the general in that order. If there's any woman in the house, I would gladly note as well.
No, it's from the men's choir. Look, I have very few, perhaps 2 or 3 questions.
One question,
Look, man, it's then you are, I don't know. Our brother there, because he spoke on Tanzania and on the failures of the project, what he says was captured by the elite, What appears to me, it seems that there is a standardized expectation to say how socialism must look like in Africa. That was a socialist project of Black Africa to give our people a different mode of production. It seems, from what he speaks, seems to be because what is Uchama is judged against seems within the traditional Western Marxist European tradition. And I feel that this then undermines Africa and its possibility to imagine a different mode of production that is successful, but it's not always judged according to Europe and how the Russian Revolution happened. So that's just my frustration. But secondly, this guy speaks on what I call the elite class, because Rodney, we must think about, okay, look, how capital leaves Europe and comes to Africa, it behaves differently. We're no longer now speaking about the traditional ruling class or the bourgeoisie. In Africa, you have the elite or the people who just capture government. But they are not the ruling class. They are the political class. So what is his conception on how we deal with those people? Because Africa has never had an opportunity where people, a class, own the means of production, and how the youth will understand the difference between the political class, which is of course fucking us up, and the ruling class, which is linked to the metropolis. I don't know.
Hi, comrades. I am Pechali from the Walter Rodney Revolutionary Library. I have been waiting for this moment for 3 years, since Chinwedu wrote that article titled Towards an Understanding of Walter Rodney. But of recent, I have been seeing a series of articles about the book, which were appearing on Africa as a Country or Roabe.net. And on that article, he put something that he does not write about on the book, which is different because he's just giving a rebel's guide of who Walter Rodney was and his revolutionary exploits. So on that article, as Laudi had raised, he raised other questions, but on that article, you make mention or you make a disagreement of what Rodney termed as the fact that Europe was not interested in the development of Africa. But you refute that claim by giving an example of Hong Kong and South Africa. And you make an argument of saying that, look, South Africa is developed, Hong Kong was also developed. But as you also write in the article, you speak about how you do not really agree with the dependency theory in the sense that, as Rodney argues, that the metropolitan bourgeoisies were not interested in the development of the third world. If you have read, I'm sure you have read how Europe underdeveloped Africa, there's a section in the last chapter where he speaks about development by contradiction. So the kind of development that was happening in South Africa or Hong Kong was not of the benefits of the indigenous people or the African people in South Africa. It was for the way of the bourgeoisies to be able to facilitate the removal of surplus value from the colonies. So I want to understand that if that position you held in that article, which gave me sleepless nights for the past 3 years,
oh my God, I'm so sorry to hear that, comrade.
How you continue to conceptualize and not fully understand the difference between classical colonialism and settler colonialism. I think you must be able to guide us through that, the difference between settler colonialism and classical colonialism. I thank you. Last one.
It's let me tweet. Comrade Chinedu, thank you for your wonderful book. It's a very good rebel's guide and a good biography. I actually don't have a problem with it. But from what you actually said today, saying that African workers are not as exploited as European workers, then it actually now came to also disturb me, and it gave me, because I was not asleep, I don't know what can I say. But in fact, statistics actually say that in South Africa, the McDonald's worker earns an average of $2.03, whilst in USA, an average McDonald's worker earns $10.57. And then in Marikana, where workers were killed, they were complaining because they were earning $260, whilst workers who were in Australia were earning $833, showing that actually African workers are supplementing European capitalism, because Australia and America, even though they might be in different continents, the people who are there are people of European descent, and they are representing European capital interests. So how do you actually support that view, even if such figures keep on coming? We show that African workers are more exploited and they are supplementing European capitalism.
Thanks, comrades, for those questions. Chinedu, here are the 3 questions, and also perhaps your closing remarks on this discussion. Thanks, Com.
That's it. There's no more questions after this. Wow. Okay. So, comrades, on the question of exploitation, again, I think you need to come back to Marx's theory of labor value, which again, I repeat, is the relationship between the wages that the workers get, which represents his ability to sleep, eat, and go back to work to the next day, and the amount of extra value that he creates for the capitalists. Exploitation is a special kind of oppression because in a sense, it's one that can be measured. You see, if a worker receives high wages but creates a huge amount of extra value for the capitalists, well, then the ratio is much higher than a worker who has very low wages, but that creates something that is less valuable for the capitalist class because naturally working with lesser technologies, etc. And in the case of when Rodney's writing How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, it's quite interesting. It'd be interesting to go back to how he tries to understand the condition of African labor, because he reads Capital Volume 7, Chapter 7, Volume 1, Chapter 7 quite a lot. And I don't think he quite gets, Marx's labor theory of value in that process. But what is clear is that the capitalist class, they invest where they think they can make a profit, right? And most of the foreign investment in the 1980s goes to where the profits are highest, where the profits can be made, and Africa gets very, very little of that. And there's of course some exceptions, like South Africa gets more than most of the continent historically, and this is why there is a stronger working class movement historically in South Africa. But other places on the African continent don't get enough. So, but what I'm saying is that imperialism treats African people way worse than European people, because even though it's not central to the profit making of the capitalist ruling class, it is nonetheless the capitalist ruling class treats Africa a bit like a bank treats ordinary people. A bank doesn't make its profit from ordinary working people, but it still wants ordinary working people to pay its debt, and so it will send a bailiff to them to squeeze anything possible out of them. And the imperialists do the same thing for Africa. Africa is not central to most of their profits and exploitative activities, but they'll squeeze anything they can out of the African working class without investing in them. And this is why in many parts, you do have a rising working class in Africa. Of course, you have more investment than when Rodney was talking about, but still, it's still much lower than other portions of the world. And that says to me that the working class is a lot more oppressed by the imperialists, but it doesn't mean necessarily that it's necessarily more exploited. And in Marxian political economy, the difference between exploitation and, if you want, oppression are things that are very different in the labor theory of value. And this is something that I'm looking into a lot deeper. And to come back to a general critique about dependency theory, well, yeah, I mean, there are definitely questions about dependency theory, because when dependency theory was on the come up in the 1950s and 60s, most of the global South was underdeveloped, and it kind of had this pessimistic idea that, you know, imperialism will, like, if you want, forever keep the global South at a very like underdeveloped stage as just a provider of like raw materials to like the countries in Europe, the West, and Japan. The problem is that theory doesn't fit the framework. You know, you've seen the rise of like the Asian tigers of China, especially the eastern part of China, which pulls in the dependency theory into question, even when dependency theory was quite prominent. You know, I have questioned on how do these Latin American thinkers, because that's what they are initially, you know, explain like the fact that places like Argentina and stuff like that received like loads of foreign investment and managed to industrialize, even though they were, if you want, like very much like under the prey of like imperialist powers. So the picture is a lot more mixed and like complex, and it can't be simply explained by the dependency paradigm. And I think the dependency paradigm doesn't pay sufficient attention to the classical Marxism theory of imperialism, because it has a very oversimplistic view of imperialism, where it's just a transfer of resources, of surplus from the global South to the global North, where imperialism is actually quite more complicated than that. That is an important factor of imperialism, but it's not what defines the system as a whole, where imperialism is a system of competition, of rivalry between different superpowers. And what's very important is that the power balance can change at different given times, right? What you've seen as capitalism restructured itself, that the manufacturing sectors in the world have gone from Europe to China, but on the other hand, that shifted the power balance. Whereas China wasn't a superpower in the 1970s, now today it's the main competitor of the US on all kinds of aspects, and increasingly on the military aspect around the South Asian China Sea. I think the dependency theory framework is too incomplete to take into account these, like, you know, this whole question of uneven development of capitalism and the changing structure of power relations. And also, like, you know, you have a newer argument of dependency theory in saying that, you know, the capitalist factories and firms are like the global South in order to exploit the workers on like lower wages as possible. And, you know, people like John Smith come up with the theory of like super exploitation, saying that capitalists are just looking for like lower wages. But you know, I'm sorry, I don't know to what extent that is true. You know, only certain sectors, like, you know, like Apple technology or call centers, like, move to the global South. A lot of the capital, like, you know, stays like very much like in place in the global North. Like, you know, you can't move, like, I don't know, I'm in London, you can't move like Heathrow Airport all the way to somewhere in the South. Heathrow Airport still has this like 80,000 workers, like in London, people who are like exploited on a large scale. So, you know, the dependency theories don't explain. Yeah. Okay. Can I move on to other questions?
Literally, you have like 30 seconds left.
30 seconds left.
Yeah.
Okay.
Prioritize.
Great. Can I just finish and say a word then in my sum up?
Sure.
Because
Go ahead.
Because I want to talk about like the 50 years of how Europe underdeveloped Africa. And I want to talk about like the significance of Rodney's work. And what it's important to remember in my final words here is that the significance of Rodney's work will always be, you know, in direct proportions to the new social movements, to the new movements like Black Lives Matter, or the new revolutionary movements that come up to the fore. And to give an example of that is that one of Rodney's comrades, right, in 1974 was in Lisbon, Portugal, during the coronation revolution, which was one of the amazing revolutions that took place in Europe at the time. It was 10 times more advanced than May 1968 in France. And we must remember that that revolution was set in motion by the struggle in the Portuguese colonies against Salazar's empire and Salazar's fascism. And what he says there is that, you know, in Portugal at the time, there was a real thirst by everybody to read How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. You can find the book in every single bookshop, because in challenging fascism, people came to hate all kinds of oppression. People came to see, you know, their destinies as tied with the people who were fighting colonialism in Africa. And they wanted against the tyrants of fascism, but also against the tyrants of imperialism who were oppressing African people. And I think that's really important in terms of the relevance of How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. I saw a glimpse of that recently with the rise of, like, you know, the Black Lives Matter movement, where people were asking questions again. People were digging up Walter Rodney and these thinkers. And I think this time, you know, we need to be prepared. We need to read Nani to be prepared to draw like the important lessons of struggle, so that the next time these movements come up, we can make sure that they reach their final conclusion and that they defeat the imperialist ruling class once and for good. And so we can build a real democratic society from below. That's all I have to say. Thank you for this discussion. I wish I had more time to answer the other questions.
Thank you, Chinito. Can you give me a round of applause, please? Thank you. I do apologize for cutting you short, but I do make a commitment that this conversation will definitely continue. Might not be today, but a session with more time will be organized. I think some great ideas and contributions were made today. And myself, as a chair, I was limited because I do have some questions and some views I would have loved to share, but I couldn't. I now know why they made me the chair of this session. I did promise that I will give the biography after the conversation. So Chenetu Chukwudima is a PhD student at the University of Oxford in Human Geography, where he researches Walter Rodney's life and legacy. Chenetu is an active member of the Socialist Workers' Party in London. He's also an active member of the editorial board of ROPE, the Review of African Political Economy. He writes on African politics, popular struggles, the history of working class resistance in African countries. He is also generally a cool person, as also you have seen. And I'm also told that he is a big fan of Kendrick Lamar's latest album. That is correct, right?
Actually, all his albums.
Yeah. All his albums, yes. I'm told. No, thank you very much for your time, Chenetu. I think this conversation and also this relationship will continue definitely.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Can you give me one last round of applause? Last but not least, a comrade who needs no introduction. Next to me, Mulaudi wa Sekake. Ukabane is an active scholar and a writer, member of the editorial committee of the scholarly journal Peace, Land and Bread, a researcher fellow at the Center for Communist Studies. He's also an author of the book Meditations from Jakarta, published in 2021, and the two volumes in front of me now of Socialism Nomuntu Omosha, Taking the Oath of Revolution, published in 2022. Ukabane is going to give us a brief, just an overview of the two books. 2 minutes. I know we are out of time. 4 minutes. 10 minutes. Not less. We're making it 5. 5 minutes is fine. 5 minutes is fine. Comrades, we must remember here. I remember Umkulu, comrades, viewers did say on Monday when we were opening this session that we are not here to give a moment of peace, but we are here to make noise in memory and acknowledgement of the efforts and the contributions of the people that have been mentioned here. So just 5 minutes, the committee is going to take us through the 2 volumes.
Thank you. No, I was not going to obey 2 minutes, even if I was given 2 minutes, honestly. I was not going to obey it. So I'll just limit my talk within 5 minutes and to give just an overview of the 2 volumes. Straight to the point. The attempt in these 2 volumes, in the proverbial speak, is to connect the dots. In most cases, when we critique the dominant cultural and economic system, we view things in isolation. We believe that things are not interrelated. When there is an incident of rape somewhere, we treat as an individual matter. When there is a problem of an insurance company refusing to process a claim of someone else, we view it as an individual problem facing that particular individual. So the attempt here is to provide a comprehensive critique of the power structure. So if there is anything you will get out of this book, that's it. So what we have done it in a very unconventional manner. You know, when you go to academia, you are told to have a subject matter. Ne? So you can't be dealing with a lot of things. No. Whoever is the supervisor will come with a red pen and say, what is your subject matter? What we have done here is to defy that logic. And that is why we have dealt with issues of mental health related illnesses, issues of gays, lesbians, and all those things, issues of environment, and issues of emotional labor that affect most of us. As a result, when people, for example, are oppressed or are experiencing brutal realities at their workplace, like Black women experiencing difficulties in restaurants, where they are told that, hey, leave your emotions at home. Here you are at work. So we have dealt with a lot of things. So we have developed, just like we did in Meditations from the Gut, we are developing a critique of the establishment through storytelling. So we are making the understanding and therefore the critique of the system through people's lived experiences. So the foundational story in the text, it's a woman from Esho. Those who know KZN, is a place called Esho. So we are not starting with complex philosophical doctrines. We are starting with people's lived encounters. So, but also we did not want to be intellectually dishonest or hypocritical. We have given evidence about the claims we made, and that is why each volume has more than 500 references. So what we have done is that in as much as we're using lived experiences, but we have also sourced some information that is going to back up this critique. And this information is based on encounters. You remember the incident which occurred, we saw it on TV, where a family which was refused to claim monies to bury its a family member was hard for. The dead body before the house, before that company. And they said, because we are refusing to process our claim, and then there was a response. So what we are trying to do is to fuse all these things that are seemingly unrelated so that we provide a comprehensive critique of the system. For example, there was a Lydia who got a job. She had an expectation that since I got a job at a baker, I'm not going to be carrying food. There won't be any need for me to carry food. I bake this bread, then I have a right to eat it. Only to find that when her and other workers wanted to eat the bread, the manager said, no, this is company property. You will have to wait for your wages to buy the bread. So we are trying to ground concepts of alienation, which in most cases are talked about in an abstract way. We ground them and link them to people's experiences. When issues of environment, when you are in Durban, there is an area called South Basin. Petrochemical refineries are that site. The pipes that are actually moving that petrol to Sasolburg, the main station, are actually going through Black communities. And at Durban, in that area, South Basin, most people suffer from asthma, environmental racism. You get a point? So we are dealing with a whole lot of issues of patents. The case in point, We are told that Black people, especially young ones, are not skilled, are not creative. Only to realize that the very companies that we admire so much are actually powered by the genius, by the creativity of the very people who are said to be unskilled and not creative. The case in point, the Vodacom saga. So it's not only that incident, there are so many incidents where big companies steal ideas. So we rally people and say, start open businesses, bring your ideas. But companies that have the money to effect ideas, while you are still waiting for funding, they run with your idea. And you don't have any power to challenge them. So those are some of the issues that we are dealing with in this text, a whole lot of things. But we are challenging the power structure. And lastly, we are always told, it's youth money, it's youth day-to-day. Young people are unemployed because they don't have skills, they don't have everything else, all those things, the justification that we are given. I am waiting for anyone who is going to tell us otherwise. The problem, the fundamental problem is not that young people are not skilled. The fundamental problem is that whatever you put forth, whatever case you come up with, the system has no interest to cater or to respond to the welfare of people. So whatever idea you come up with, it will always shift the goalpost. I live in a township, trucks and vans of white people. It's called Claremont in Devon. It's surrounded by suburbs, Westfield, Kloof, and New German. I can tell you without any doubt in mind, people who are doing flooring and roofing of those mansions are the very people who are said to be unskilled. I think it happens in almost every township. So, and the most important thing is, why should a human being struggle to fit into a thing? We're always told young people are writing CVs, updating CVs to fit into the so-called economy. Why can't we model our economy in such a way that it responds to the needs of human beings? And what does it mean to have an economy that doesn't respond to the question of human development? So those are some of the things that we challenge, the assumptions that are so dominant, even in the economic arena, that are even perpetuated by academia and mainstream scholarship in this text. So that is the long and short of it. We can say a lot. We have only brought few copies for display here. Some have always been ordered, and those who want to order, we can interact with them to access copies and continue the discourse. Until lions learn to read, tales of hunting will always glorify the hunter. And that is why we are doing what we are doing. It is a labor of love. Thank you very much.
Sadly, my job has come to an end. So this is how we are closing the series of Walter Rodney Makabane. It has been a great experience. We wish we could keep it long, but this is how far we could go. Comrades, we are about to go to the last session of the entire series, which is the cultural event, or the master of ceremony, which is Comrade Zama. Who else is fitted for such a role? So as Ukabane comes, Lomthosa lo, Africa, Lomzulu lo, Africa, Lomtswana lo, Africa, Lomzulu lo, Africa, Lomthosa lo, Africa, Masha, wethu, Amanda, hi, Moral, listen, just for announcements on how we're gonna work from now.
then comrades can go and chat. Comrades, there's two things that I'm here to announce, is that we will have refreshments now until 4. We'll start exactly at 4:15 with the cultural night. But people are here, that's what I'm saying, people must be here at 4 to come back. I mean, the thing is that it's 20 minutes to 4, but yeah, that's also fine. We'll see how that works. Yeah, that's what I'm announcing. Please come back here at 4. Just give space for the artists and the creatives to do their sound checks and stuff. We are downstairs. Yeah, in the courtyard. Yeah, sure, comrades. Amanda, how are you too?